Good evening, everyone. We're glad you could join us for today's session on podcasting and journalism. Let me begin by introducing our speaker for today, Anirban Chowdury. Anirban is a seasoned journalist and an award winning podcast executive with over 17 years of experience across aviation, logistics, and global business reporting. His work spans leading publications such as the Wall Street Journal and the Economic Times. As the executive producer of The Morning Brief, Anirban has created and hosted hundreds of episodes covering everything from corporate strategy and climate change to India China trade and global geopolitics. Renowned for his sharp editorial acumen and narrative craft, he has interviewed top global CEOs and spearheaded award winning investigative podcasts, earning honors from SOPA and the India Audio Summit. Please join me in welcoming Anirban. Before we start today's session, I request that our learners post their questions in the Q&A tab. We will try to address as many as possible if the time permits. At the end of the session, we will display three polls on your screens and request that you actively participate in these polls to help us understand your grasp of what was covered in the webinar. Correct answers will then be displayed once the polls have been answered. With that in mind, here's a very warm welcome to you, Anirban. We're glad to have you present at the Ed Talk webinar. Over to you for the main session.
Thank you so much, Meghna, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. I'm very excited to be talking to what seems to be a pretty large cohort of students, and it's I can see this expanding. Sorry. Thank you for that introduction, and just let me add to it. My name is Anirban Chaudhary. I've been a journalist for 17 years, with first with Business Standard Delhi, then with the Wall Street Journal, and for the last more than 12 years with the Economic Times. Now. I've been, for the larger part of my career, a print journalist, right? And I've sort of written for the paper, and I used to cover aviation and logistics. And what brought me into podcasting, say about 3 years back, is basically the core of what this conversation is also about. And in one line, it's the fact that I was sort of more or less bored with just one form of storytelling, where outside of me and externally, and I could see forms of storytelling and content creation becoming more and more synonymous with news generation, and expanding across so many vistas, right? So that is, in a nutshell, what brought me into podcasting. I joined as a host, then I became a host and a producer because I really liked audio. I'm a musician as well, an amateur musician, so there was a sort of an affinity that I felt towards the world of sound, as much as I felt towards writing. And so they sort of intersected at some point, and I dived really headlong into the world of audio storytelling and visual storytelling later as well. A few months down the line, I became the executive producer of the show, The Morning Brief. After that, I've started new shows, special series. We recently started a new show called The Morning Brief, for just a sort of a very brief introduction, is a news podcast which drops every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, in which, and this is all important because we will talk about news podcasts during the course of this conversation. It's a news podcast that drops every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. Some of you may have heard it if you are avid podcast listeners and especially want to keep up with the news. We choose pieces of news that have longer shelf lives, that are sort of the news of the week, and that can span longer conversations and give us depth to sort of explore several aspects. That's the Morning Brief in a nutshell, which I steer and host and produce, etc. The other show that we've started very recently is called Corner Office Conversation, which is conversations with global CEOs and founders of very interesting businesses, the most sort of interesting business leaders of the world. And we've got the CEOs of, say, Uber to Salesforce to Cognizant to Adobe, and many, many more. And they are like very, very rewarding conversations on what drives them, what sort of worries them, geopolitics, what is the environment like, AI, tech, etc., etc., and what lies ahead, basically. So these are the two shows that I steer. um let's, with that in context, and please remember whatever I told you, because all conversations on podcasting for me are very, very personal conversations. Let's go to the first slide and look at what are podcasts, right? So usually my conversations are very, very conversational and interactive, and I throw open the question to the audience or the viewers as to what you think are podcasts. But since there is no such scope of that and the time is limited, let me straight away go to the most basic definition of podcasts, right? So podcasts are recorded conversations. It could be a conversation between you and me, between me and all of you, between me and Meghna, between me, Meghna, and Siddharth, uh, in a closed, sort of intimate sort of an environment, which are recorded and then distributed digitally. It's usually not live, it's edited, etc. And there are several kinds of conversations and several kinds of podcasts that we'll come to later. But what differentiates a podcast from a normal conversation? I mean, four people chatting on the street, having a Coke or a smoking break may or may not be a podcast. And what would make a conversation a podcast? It's what would discern a conversation into becoming a podcast. It's these three qualities. I'm sorry. One is, of course, that the conversation needs to be engaging. There are podcasts, and some of you who have already listened to podcasts would know this. There are podcasts which span 3, 4, 5 hours. That is how long they have to hold your attention. Maybe not at one point. Maybe you listen to it for half an hour, go and do your office work, etc. Then the next day you again come back for the next half an hour, etc. And then you span 5 hours. But the discerning factor is that you are engaged most of the time. How does a podcast keep you engaged is something that we'll come to in later slides. Inclusivity is extremely important. So for example, if Meghna and I, or one of you, I don't know your names obviously, but let's say Amit, and I, let's say there's someone called Amit in the audience, and Amit and I have a conversation, and Meghna is listening to it. uh, it'll only be a podcast if she feels that even without being an active participant in the conversation, asking me questions or Amit questions in this example, she should feel that she is part of that room, right? That is inclusivity, and that is exactly how a podcast is structured, which makes it different from any other conversation or a panel discussion, or say a webinar, for instance, right? The other thing is that it's customized. Now, by customized, I don't necessarily mean that if you ask me tomorrow for a podcast on, say, hockey, I will make it for you in a customized manner. No, that's not what I mean. Customized means that there are so many different kinds of podcasts to be consumed that, according to your interest, you can choose it and just plug in your headphones and play it, and it becomes a very, very personal experience, customized to the kind of queries you have or the thirst for knowledge that you might have, right? Personalized, basically, you know basically very synonymous with what I mean by customized, but also one redeeming factor of a podcast, always the better podcasts, you will always see the personal factor, both from the host or the interviewer and the people that he's talking to. It's always, I felt this. If it's, for example, a podcast on the electric vehicle, I would say that, when I was in the US last year, I drove my friend's Tesla, and this is what the experience I had was. What do you think, Mr. Say Mr. Rajesh Jejurikar, who's the head of Mahindra and Mahindra Automotive, which is now very, very high on EVs, right? So if I have an interview with him, would you compare your XCV, for instance, that you own, and pardon me if I got the name incorrect, with the Tesla that I rode, and then he says, no, 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 when I ride the XCV, my experience is this. That's what sort of differentiates a podcast. It becomes personal and personalized. So these four very, very important factors. Uh, I don't delve too much into the history of podcasts, because my experience says that it becomes a little irrelevant in the larger scheme of things, primarily because the medium has evolved so much and changed so much in the last few years, that the history is not really relevant to understanding what a podcast is. But I'll tell you that it started in the 1980s, but it became popular in the year after the year 2003 with this particular invention, which a lot of people, with this particular appliance or device, which a lot of people would know. This is called the iPod. It was launched by Apple in 2003. How it differentiated from, so we had already sort of by the 2000s, we had already come to sort of storing our music, right? From the era of audio cassettes, we had come to storing our music in MP3 players. This revolutionized that segment by storing thousands and thousands and thousands of songs, but also podcasts, which basically started as audio blogs or audio files in RSS feeds, which is very different from just text in RSS feeds, which used to be the case. So podcast is a portmanteau word, which is like an amalgamation of two words, which is iPod and broadcast. So iPod ka pod, broadcast ka cast, podcast. This is how it became popular. But of course, like I said, the medium, it has really, really, really evolved over the last several years. And the best way to gauge that evolution is to understand how many kinds of podcasts there are. Of course, audio and video. Whatever is audio podcast can also be video. So we'll sort of limit our conversation today to sort of audio podcast, because video, and I'll talk a little bit about video podcast, but they're not extremely different in their core or the four qualities that I mentioned, right? So let's look at the different kind of podcasts. The most popular or the most basic form, and the form that has been in vogue since the time podcasts started, is the interview or the conversation, right? The most and this is a quality that is that spans across your audio and video podcasts, right? So the most popular podcast of the world arguably is the Joe Rogan Experience. It's gone into some 3,000, 5,000 episodes now. This is one of the most popular conversation podcasts, and he's got all sorts of people there, starting from Sundar Pichai to baseball players to actors to, of course, Elon Musk. Elon Musk is a huge fan, patron, and a regular participant, so much so that he's often said things in the podcast that he's not said on news channels. So the Joe Rogan Experience has often become a source of news about Elon Musk and his business ventures. For instance, there was one in, I think, 2019 or 2020, wherein Elon Musk, in this podcast for the first time, spoke about his space ventures and what he was planning to do with them. He's not spoken about them in a press release, press conference, internally. Of course, internally he would have, but outside in the public domain, he'd never spoken about it. So that's how powerful podcasts have been becoming in the last 2-3 years. Trevor Noah, most of you would know. He's a humorist, a stand-up comedian. He used to be a journalist, a content creator. Extremely engaging podcast, one of my favorites, and you should check it out. You should check out Joe Rogan as well, of course, whoever hasn't. One of my favorites is his pod, with a recent pod. In fact, it came out last year, with Yuval Noah Harari, who happens to be one of my favorite authors and thinkers and historians. Brilliant podcast, just about 45 minutes. Joe Rogan, for instance, like I was saying, his pods span 3 to 4 hours often. So, and it's often unwieldy to sort of cover all of it. But these two podcasts, the Lex Friedman podcast is another fairly famous one. It's more of the journalistic kinds, very cut and dried, very serious. You see the stayed, the picture here. He's wearing a black suit. This is how he is all the time, with the black background. He's also a really, really long conversations. He's got people like the Ukrainian head of state Vladimir Zelensky, to very recently Prime Minister Narendra Modi. That was also like a 3-hour conversation. It went completely viral, etc. Of course, we've had Indian podcasters as well. One actually, Nikhil Kamath, who's got Prime Minister Modi onto his podcast. But these are sort of the most famous one, and these are very, very different kind of conversations, right? So Joe Rogan is like very, very casual. It's like two people sitting at a bar and talking. Trevor Noah, very argumentative, lots of debate, very chunky. Lex Friedman, again, very, very, like I said, staid, serious, sometimes emotional, stark. That's the kind of conversation he likes. But all of them are doing extremely well. Yeah. But these uh, are all interview podcasts which are not located to any particular topic or genre. But the next slide I'm going to will tell you the different genres that podcasts cover. So, true crime, one of the most popular genres ever, and Serial, by a New York Times um journalist called Sarah Koenig, and you should check it out if you're interested, is one of the most famous ones. It's a podcast type called the narrative podcast, where you tell stories like, a person narrates a story, and it is enhanced with sort of sound effects, with quotes, with small interviews, but there is a series and it explores the story. This is not one conversation, but several, which is happening between the host and some of the guests, between the host and you. And the idea is to tell you a story from start to finish, and the idea is to give you sort of, Serial is an audio podcast, so the idea is to give you sort of an audio documentary. History is again between William Dalrymple, again one of my absolute favorite authors and historians, with Anita Anand. It's about different empires, right from the Turks, um, the Ottoman Empire, to to the East India rule over the British rule over India. These are mostly conversations, again, because there's a sort of an intersection between narrative and interview. But these tell mostly long form stories that William Dalrymple is saying, this is what happened this time, and then this. So it's sort of a clear intersection between narrative and interview. Radio Labs deal with tech and science. Really, really interesting podcast, an award winning podcast. Whoever is interested in science should definitely check it out. They use a lot of soundscaping, right? Which makes it very, very interesting. The next form is the news podcast, which is sort of the topic that we want to sort of really go deep into today. The most famous news podcasts of the world are obviously produced by the most prominent news publications, right? So we have the Journal from the Wall Street Journal, we have the Daily from the New York Times, we have the Global News Podcast from BBC, and in a smaller way, of course, we have the Morning Brief from the Economic Times. Now, uh, different formats, again, because we've come to a different subsection. This is an intersection between, again, narrative and interview. If you listen to the Morning Brief, we have several episodes which are in a narrative format. For example, I did an episode on the Kashmir elections. We got a lot of voices from Kashmir there, and it was completely narrative, with a lot of music, with a lot of even folk music, just to transport you, to that realm when you're telling a story, right? This is something that a text interview, that a text story on the newspaper will never give you. It gives you layers and texture, right? And even more when it goes into an audio when it goes into a video documentary. But that is sort of what we try to do here. And we have interviews as well. The Journal is also a mix of interviews and narrative. The Daily is primarily narrative between the host and usually a journalist, or one or more journalists of the New York Times. BBC has a very interesting format where it takes more than one piece of news during one episode. For example, if it's a 20-minute episode, 5 minutes on four pieces of news, and one journalist covering that news, talking about it in four small interviews, right? But the core ethos of all of this is the same, that we should give you a little more in terms of experience, data, insights, than a newspaper or a web, a story on the web, which is just text based, or even a video could sort of give you. So that is, it could be, so a 16-minute episode, for instance, if you transcribe it to text, it would be not less than 4,000 words, right? So that's the kind of depth we are talking about. This is the kind of topics that we have to choose, which would span half an hour and 4,000 words of text that we can discuss and we can give you, right? Now, the question which leads me to my next slide is, why are news podcasts so important? Why are they, in fact, the new newsroom, right? The reasons, a lot of you will be absolutely familiar with the reasons. One is trust deficit in traditional media. This is something that we all face, right from how the Western media is covering or not covering the Israel-Palestine conflict and the atrocities on Palestinians, to how we have often made mockeries of news, right? Like the Air India crash, for instance, or right from COVID to the Air India crash. There is a growing trust deficit among people who want honest to goodness, authentic news analysis, and they turn to other forms of content, Instagram Reels, YouTube videos, YouTube analysis, and one huge medium that they turn to is podcast. So at the morning brief, we constantly one of the biggest drivers of the podcast is a lot of research. Of course, AI, and we'll talk briefly about AI as we go ahead. But tech is very very important. The more you use tech, the more content you can generate, the more research you can do, the more summaries, the more and the deeper you can go into a subject in lesser amount of time. And that is very 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 important when you're trying to differentiate, or you're trying to give the viewer a differentiated sort of an offering from what they would get in a TV channel or the newspaper, right? Mobile first, Gen Z, millennials, very very um, of course, very, very obvious. There was a previous slide in which there was a Spotify data which said that 67% of podcast consumers are between the ages of 18 and 34, right? This one, 12 and 34 monthly podcast listeners. This is from Spotify. Thank you so much, Meghna. We can go back. I was just referring to it. Yeah. So this is one platform democratization, huge. It's actually something that is the main reason for revolutionizing content in the last few years. YouTube, Spotify. Tomorrow, if you know the tools, if you have the passion, if you have a story to tell, one of you can start a podcast. And if you have a really good story to tell, you could outperform the morning brief in the matter of weeks. That is the democratization that a platform gives you. And this is so, so brilliant, because it's no news and information is no longer a monopoly of publication. And I say, so even though I'm a journalist, it's no longer up to the Economic Times to give you the only authentic information on what is happening in a company. It could come from a chartered accountant or a former CFO, for instance, um, or a stock market evangelist who knows more and understands more and can describe more, and he can form. And there are podcasts by professionals which are doing much much better than a news publication can ever do. So this is a huge point. News fatigue is very very similar to what I said in the first one. Just one form of news, the same reason that got me into podcasting, the same format. People are sort of the tickers and the flashes and the loud music and the loud arguments. A lot of people, or the state text, a lot of people are bored with it. They tend to find and seek and find newer forms of storytelling and content and news, which is the four basic reasons. Now, I said that one of you could start a podcast, and we'll delve into what makes a good podcaster. But before that, what is the structure that you need to follow? As you can see, the structure, the reason why podcasts are sprouting up a dozen by the day across the world, of course, not in India, is that it is so simple to do. And yet, so, I mean, it's not shallow, it's very deep, but the contours and the way of doing it and the technique, etc., it's really, really simple. Just look at the structure. It's sort of the simplest structure that you can come up with, like intro, main body, outro. No matter which podcast you listen to in the world, you can divide them into these three structural points, right? The intro, which is basically how you tease the viewer or the audience into the subject that you're going to talk about. Usually, you know, you could, if you're planning to do your own podcast, start with a data point saying, did you know that these many women are still unemployed in India? And this is not me saying, this is government statistics, and it is true. Actually, there was sort of um, a statistic that was I think that was shared by the Center for Statistics or the Ministry of Statistics, and it actually gave very stark examples of how much unemployed or disguised unemployed there is among women. So that's how you start, and then you go to the main body. You tease with a few questions. You say this is what we are going to sort of delve into in this episode, and then you go to the main body, which could be you talking about it, or the host talking about it, and or uh, you could talk to a guest who could be an expert, who could be a researcher, could be a lawyer, could be a woman who's uh, who's working but is married. And this is just one topic I'm giving. Of course, there are hundreds of other topics that you could sort of explore. That could be sort of a long conversation or a short one. And then the outro, which is basically, and I said, remember, I use the word personal and personalized. So the best outros or closing comments are usually the ones where you tell the viewer what your takeaways are. Once you tell them what your takeaways are, they are encouraged to formulate their takeaways internally as well. It works very, very in terms of, if you go into sort of behavioral patterns, etc., of how people consume content, the more personal you make the content, the more personal they will be their consumption of it too. So that's how. And I'm not kidding. I'm saying it after producing about 800 podcasts. This is really how simple the basic structure is. And you and I and any of you can make a podcast tomorrow. And I hope some of you do. And we'll delve into more into it probably in the last 15 minutes when we deal with questions. The next one, right? The tools, right? How do you make a podcast? um, a mic is really important, but is not necessarily expensive. This I specifically, for people who really want to start their own podcast. And I'm sure among 519 now, it was just 520 just a second before, I'm sure there are at least 10 people who want to start their own podcast sometime in their lives. This is the mic that we use. It's a great mic. It's a USB mic, very, very technically simple. Just plug it into your computer and record. These are the recording software. It just StreamYard, Zencaster, Riverside, varying degrees of costs. Of course, there are free versions of them also, but the paid versions are obviously a lot better. And how they work just like a Zoom call or a Microsoft Teams call. How they are different is that they make for better sound quality. Even they cut ambient noise, etc., which you don't want in a podcast. Like I said, intimate settings, personalized, in engaging. These are all things that you constantly need to remember. And these are software that are made so that the conversation becomes, at least sonically, sound wise, they are more and more intimate and engaging, right? Descript is a great editing software. I can't sort of, a second, just a sec. How do I minimize this? Because I can't see what I've what is this I've written here, Meghna? Yeah. Right. Sorry. I get it. Right. So editing, Descript is what we use. Descript, it's a fascinating AI based software which edits sound like you edit Word, right? It just transcribes your conversation in the form of a Word document. And whatever you do with the words, the same things happen with the sound. So if you strike through a sentence, that is muted in the audio file. It's a fascinating software for whoever, and there is a video editing software here as well, which works the same way. It's just amazing how easy it makes editing, right? Just like AI is making coders of non-coders. These are software which make sound engineers or video editors of absolute novices like me, right? Hosting, um the biggest one to host is actually Spotify for creators is something that that's the simplest way, but there are others also. Buzzsprout is one. Acast is one. We'll delve a little bit about into monetizing a podcast very soon. But Acast is a platform which helps you to host a podcast as well as gives you monetization streams. Basically, makes or helps you to make money on your podcast. Transistor, Buzzsprout, very, very similar. That's where you host your podcast. Distribution, of course, YouTube podcast, huge. It's a late entrant into the podcast field. It used to be Google Podcast before. Now everything is on YouTube, and it's huge. It's both video and audio. and it's already overtaken, sorry, Spotify and Apple. But Spotify remains the OG for podcasters because it gives you a platform to host and distribute podcasts as well. And Apple, of course, is Apple. Then you have your Amazon Music, etc. um, if you start a podcast, it's advisable that you are on every single platform, because you never know. Because we were surprised only last year to find out that the maximum number of our listeners come from Apple Podcasts and not Spotify, and a large number of them are based overseas. We have a large number of listeners, for example, in Dubai and the US. So that was a feedback that helped us understand that we should go for global topics more and more, which is something we have done, and that's helped our listenership as well. And all that is very, very important when you're creating podcasts, just as it is important when you're creating any kind of content. uh Skill sets, very simple but sort of focused. One is the topic. Only make a podcast when you have something to talk about, right? um Sorry, yeah. uh Only choose a topic when you have something to talk about, and preferably choose a topic which is either something that you're passionate about, something that you're very knowledgeable about, or something that you're extremely curious about. So the former two qualities will obviously make you talk to the listener a lot more effectively, while the last one, which is very, very important, especially when you see podcast from the journalism prison, that curiosity and asking the good set of questions is extremely, extremely important, right? So you have two podcasters in India, the Ranveer Allahabadia, Raj Shamani. Uh, why their podcast? I mean, not my two favorite podcasters by any stretch, but why they became famous is because they were not shy of asking the most basic questions to the most important, complicated sort of people, right? They will go, so Ranveer Allahabadia will get like a uh, like a genome expert, and or like an AI expert, and ask him, some very, very basic question like how does this software work or whatever, and people really, really, really relate to that. So choose a topic which you're passionate about or curious about, and that's the most important thing. Interviewing, conversational but not casual. Be involved because it's very important for it to be engaging. Fast-paced podcasts do very well. There was a time when, if you listen to the earlier podcast, like say about 5 years back, and it's something that's changed very recently. There used to be this, and there are many memes on podcasts that have come of you. If you look at Instagram, that were very, very slow-paced. What do you think will happen if Israel were to bomb? So that is gone now, especially with the growth of more and more video podcast. The conversation has become more fast paced, but very high quality, insightful. Never let go of insights and great questions and great conversation. But these are things that you need to keep in mind. You don't want to bore. The attention span of a listener is the least. It's less than a reader, it's much less than a viewer, right? So it's the least, and whenever you're doing an audio podcast, you need to really take care of these things. Video also, not to that extent, but definitely you will need to take care of how pacey, how well edited, etc. you want to make it. Scripting, voice modulation, do a lot of research. Like I said in the beginning, we do a lot of research at ET, and the amount of research that is done for a podcast often differentiates it from a bad podcast. um, Brevity, it connects to the fast paced yet insightful. Keep your sentences short. Evocative, uh, create a picture in people's minds, especially is true, especially of audio podcasts, but also sometimes video podcasts. Keep it simple, but make people imagine things, right? If you're explaining a difficult concept to them, rephrase that in the simplest possible sentences so that they can think of analogies that make that connect in their heads, right? Personal, friendly, these are qualities that I spoke about. Visual sound design, very important in narrative podcasts. How you use your music, your SFX to not manipulative but effective. How you not intrusive, like I said, how you put the point across or create a picture in somebody's mind. And visual design, of course, in a podcast, how sort of clean is the setting, how intimate, well lit, etc. Which is, I mean, these are things that really differentiate one podcast from the other. Editing is very important, and the thumb rule for it is that your attention span is equal to the audience's attention span. So if you listen back to a conversation when you're editing it and you feel that at 2 minutes 30 seconds your attention is wavering, be sure that this is the time when the thousands of people that you're talking to through your podcast, their attention will also snap at that time. This is where you edit. It's a very, very clear litmus test that you do for any kind of content that you create, right? Promotion, of course, very, very important. Making sort of your the teasers or the posts on LinkedIn, Instagram, etc., etc. How you promote it, how well you promote it is very, very important. But that, of course, the basis of it is great content and great conversations, and of course, promotions come later. AI, great add to podcasts. In fact, uh, there is a podcaster called Varun Maya who's done this. The techies will know this, and I hope there are a lot of techies here who's done this absolutely path-breaking podcast with Satya Nadella, where he said for the first time, and this is very ironic actually, where he said for the first time that software as a service will die, and agentic AI, and whoever knows this, or you can go ahead and Google because we have limited time. Agentic AI will write software in the future, and it will replace software developers. Now, the irony about it is many of Varun Maya's podcasts are not hosted by himself; they are hosted by his AI avatars. And it's insane how this trend is catching on onto podcasters. This is something that you can use as well. Very easily generated. One, I've not mentioned the name here, but one software to do it, AI tool to do it, is called HeyGen. Please look it up on YouTube and Toots if you want to create podcasts like that. Another thing which is very, very extremely prevalent is modifying your voice using AI tools. One thing that does it very well is 11 Labs. The other side is, of course, AI generated video editors like this one. This is Premiere Cut Pro. Autopod is like an AI built software or tool that cuts your video. But this side of it, I can say, the video editing and the production side of it, AI is not as sort of adept as it should be. It's more adept at generating. Of course, you have a lot of video generation software like your Mid Journey, DALI, for instance, Sora, which is part of OpenAI's offerings. These are software these are tools, AI generated tools, AI power tools, sorry, which are very, very easy to learn, and you should definitely make a point of dilly dallying or playing around with them if you want to make quality podcasts, because they are the present and not the future. They are the present of content generation. They're making content generation, podcast creation more and more efficient, cost effective, and these are stuff that you can definitely use, right? um, One example, the next slide. The one example of a completely AI generated podcast is something called uh, Notebook LM, where you can just upload. So what I used to do once is, we had a short stint. We had briefly started a podcast called 7 at 7, which was 7 pieces of news summarized in 7 minutes at 7 a.m. every day. So as you know, since I have a lot on my plate and I work with a very small team, it was not possible for me every day to cull out, summarize and write a script and record every day at like, if I had to, if I were to drop it at 7 a.m., obviously my day would start at 5:30. It's not possible every day. So I tried something called Notebook LM. It didn't work. But what I used to do here is, I used to upload the PDF copy of the newspaper and say, just choose the five uh, top pieces of news and summarize it into a 7-minute podcast. Why it didn't work is the voices that they used were had a heavy accent. They were both Americans, and so it wouldn't work with an Indian audience, of course. But the discussion and the conversation were top notch, and it was done in a matter of 30 seconds, 60 seconds, possibly. So, is there an AI generated podcast? Most definitely there is. Okay. Monetization, very, very important. Various ways to monetize it, of course. One is sponsorship and ads, um, which is very similar to what you would see on YouTube. You approach companies, or you go to. So there are two ways to do it, obviously. One is that you reach a certain amount of listenership, and then the platform, if you are on Spotify itself will help you got to sort of get sponsorship, which could be a 5 second space in between your podcast for a brand to come. The other one is, of course, you approach brands yourself and or companies and say this is a podcast. So for example, that works very well with B2B podcasts. For example, if you have a wealth podcast, right, a personal wealth podcast, so you obviously go to, say, if you have a podcast, say, called the HNI playbook, right, how rich people get rich. So the kind of company that you would want to approach is, say, a Nuvama, right, which deals a lot with with HNIs, right? So these are the two ways in which you can get sponsorships and ads, which is the most popular form of monetization. Subscription models, of course, YouTube has it a lot. It helps. This is paid form of content. Doesn't always work because people want content free, especially in India. But that is absolutely what a lot of companies, publications try. Publications across the world, of course, try it a lot because so what they do is, for example, The Economist has a lot of podcasts. They bundle it with their other forms of news products and then sell it as a subscription. So that works very well, right? ET tried to do it. Well, I mean, we are still trying to sort of perfect that subscription model, but we haven't sort of, branded. Branded proposals and collabs is something that you can do. We, for instance, at ET did a series with the Bombay Stock Exchange about how market dynamics and investment regulations and tricks of the trade, and how to choose between whatever traders and the fraud that is happening. So we did sort of a 7-part series, and it was through a collab with Bombay Stock Exchange, and it was called ET Wealth and Beyond. It did phenomenally well, and sort of it was obviously a paid collab with Bombay Stock Exchange. It had their branding. It had a few guests from the Bombay Stock Exchange as well on the podcast, and that is another form of monetization. Crowdfunding. Very popular more in the West than in India because podcasts, it's still a niche thing in India unless you go for video podcasts like the ones that I mentioned. Crowdfunding is a format. There are platforms such as Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Patreon is absolutely for podcasts. Buy Me a Coffee is for other forms of content, etc. as well, where you put up your podcast and say, "This is something I'm trying to build, compelling stories, etc." And you do the crowdfunding like you usually do it, right? Ending with challenges, because there are quite a few, and I wanted to end them because I didn't want you to be discouraged before any of you want to start a podcast. Discoverability is a huge challenge, obviously, because the space is already hugely, massively cluttered. There are more than 5 million podcasts in the world across platforms. Being discovered in that kind of a crowd, best of luck. But it's not impossible, because there are a listener won't listen to just one podcast at any given day. I am listening to at least 5. There are people who listen to 10 a day. So there is a lot of competition. Yes, discoverability is not easy, but once you are discovered, habit building, difficult, yes, but it's not impossible. Retention, statistics show that attention invariably for everyone wavers uh, after 10 minutes. And it's if it's a series, uh, if it's a show, it would taper off after say two, three, 4 episodes. That's where you need to constantly get your consumer, get your viewer, get your listener back. And it's quite a task because we are in an age of really shortening attention spans. Remember that I told you that the biggest consumer, the biggest cohort that you're catering to are people aged from anywhere between 12 and 34, and the 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, etc. If there are people as old as me who have children, or older than me who have teenagers, they will realize what I'm talking about. Attention is quite 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 a challenge. Platform dependence. I talked about the fact that platforms have made it possible for the democratization of that space, which is a huge point. Platform dependence is a small challenge. It's a challenge for sure, because a Spotify will obviously, it's not always great content that Spotify will promote. It has its own sort of algorithmic compulsions, etc., or tie-ups that it wants to promote first. So you're obviously dependent on the platform that you are presenting or dropping your podcast on. It's not a huge challenge, but it's a challenge for sure. Monetization limits. This is very true in India because people haven't yet. It's s- scalability or scaling up like any other business is also true of content. So unless you get to thousands and thousands of listeners, monetization or you're catering to a particular brand, which would be a great fit. Monetization just on the basis of great content, a great podcast could be a little difficult, but none of this is an unsurmountable challenge. And I mean, we've been doing this. Uh, there have been challenges that we faced, but we've been doing this, so it's not impossible. Okay, let's pod is, I wanted to do away with this slide because uh, the other cohorts, this is probably the seventh or eighth cohort that I'm doing, and I do it a lot with school students as well. And I end at let's pod because the next bit is usually them making a small podcast along with my team, but we are not doing that obviously. What we are doing, although, and I think I'm just 1 minute, I've just spilled it over by 1 minute. We are opening the floor for questions if you have any.
Right, we'll get to the Q&A soon, Anirban. Dear learners, it's time to move to the polls. Remember, everyone who answers all questions correctly will receive a certificate that you can proudly share on various platforms. You're now requested to answer the polls on your screens and respond based on your comprehension of the session. Please note that to answer each question, you only have 1 minute.
I see a lot of questions, though. Interesting ones.
Yes, yes. Uh, if you want, you can start answering them. Would you want me to read them for you?
No, I can choose because there are quite a few.
Sure.
I can't. Yeah, I want to know how can I get into journalism. Okay. Wow, what a a difficult question. I don't know how old you are, Anshu, but journalism is obviously no rocket science. If you have the some of the skills that I spoke about, if you have questions in your mind, if you really want to know about a particular topic, if you think you have stories to tell, if you have a subject expertise, that's all. And if you have writing and slash or speaking skills, which is very important, I don't think anything's stopping you. But journalism is changing every day, is metamorph I mean, it's morphing into very different shapes. So I would advise you to be very careful before you wish to get into this profession. But yeah, it's not very difficult. Essential skills, I think I already spoke about. Um, okay. The- how do I go back to the questions? Yeah. The essential skills I already spoke about: conversational, good writing, choose a great topic, be curious, try to make it engaging. Journalism students, all of these are important for journalism students, especially fact checking, research, choosing the right kind of story that you want to tell. How do you differentiate from the other forms of news platforms that there are? All of this, right? Choose topics and guests for your podcast. Some of it I covered in my discussion. Topics which have a longer shelf life, which are deeper, which would basically give you two things, two litmus tests. One, the topic has to give you a sharp headline. Two, the topic has to span a conversation of half an hour, right? Guests, of course, two things: subject experts, good speakers. Subject experts is much more important. We have seen that our listeners are very, very patient with people who can't maybe speak well but know a lot. So, but these two are usually the kinds. I mean, subject experts, of course, would be your consultants, your CEOs, etc. In our case, but could be lawyers, doctors, bankers, etc. Right? Um, Podcast trending is booming. What are your views regarding future of podcasts in this era of AI? What do you think, whether this trend can be replaced or not? As every and if this trend replaces, okay, deep questions. Yeah, I mean, there's no straight answer to this. Podcasting trend has been booming because there are, see, people will always find ways to tell stories. If it's not podcast, it'll be something else. Maybe it'll be virtual reality, in the future. But it is also true that podcasting itself is taking different forms. It started as a huge audio trend. Now there's a plethora of video podcasts that you see. They are changing every day. They're very, some of them are becoming like conversations, panels, some like films, some like documentaries. So podcasting itself is broadening in terms of its contours. So, and AI is just a tool. It's a fallacy to say that AI will replace everything, as long as only the AI users, as everybody says, as most wise people in this field say, only the good users of AI will replace the non-users. AI itself will not replace humans, right? um this is admin question. Which podcast? Don't know the context. I want to start in video editing YouTube channel. How can you? Oh, so Dinesh, this is very this is the easiest thing to do these days, actually. Too many brilliant free tutorials available on YouTube and on the internet. Video editing YouTube channel. Just open YouTube, go for video editing, look at what kind of software you can download, and just go from there. It's you just need a little bit of tenacity. Give yourself 10-20 minutes at the end of the day every day. That's how we are all learning, by the way. I was not an audio editor when I started podcasting. I can decently edit audios now. Audio editors that came to our team are video editors now, and they started and they learned on the job. So lots of brilliant resources. In fact, there are videos on YouTube which would answer the most micro, even the silliest questions that you and I would have, right? What is a green screen? Just type that on YouTube and you will find an answer, right? So not impossible at all. All the best. Even if you start a podcast, to scale it or even is quite difficult given the short attention span. Is podcast really worth the craze? I don't know, man. Is anything really worth the craze? Good podcasts are worth the craze. The bad ones are not. But then, like everything else in the world, often you see in every field, there are the mediocre ones which often do well. The good ones take time, but it's a very philosophical question. But the fact that it's difficult to gain popularity is something that I covered in my conversation. AI is absolutely an advantage. It's a massive advantage especially when it comes to content creation. Podcast is a huge example of content creation. AI is fascinating. AI, you have to only learn the ways to properly use AI. It's from research to writing to editing to generating images and multimedia. It's an absolutely fascinating tool. Learn it today. And I don't think anybody will sort of um, repent. Can you please enable the audio?
Anirban, if you could just give me a moment to share the screen for the correct answers.
Oh yeah, sure, 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 go ahead.
Yeah. So, learners, these are the correct answers, correct options for the poll. All three options are option C, 67%, fast paced yet insightful conversation, and platform dependence. Yeah, Anirban, please continue.
Okay. For a podcast conversation, what should I cut or what should I keep? Important question. I dealt with some of it. Like I said, your attention span is the audience's attention span. Everything that distracts you, everything that you find unnecessary while editing is what you should cut. That's the biggest litmus test. Of course, then there are others like, say, too many segues or too many, what's that called, digressions is something, what how can I go from a vague idea to a compelling episode? You should start at the opposite end. Never start with a vague idea. Start with a firm idea. Like I said, the one biggest litmus test for a podcast is if you have a headline or a title. Unless you have that, it's not a podcast. It's not a compelling podcast. Go with a sharp idea, and then it automatically leads to a compelling episode. How do I tell my guests to tell you great stories? Just ask for great stories. Tell your guests, um, give rephrase this, and they're all recorded conversations, right? So tell me this the same point in the form of an anecdote. Did this happen to you? And keep probing. Or you tell your own stories. I'll tell you my story. This is what happened to me. Did this happen to you? Once you open up, your guest will also open up. But this is a great question because it encompasses. This is anonymous attendee at 746. I don't know who this is, but it encompasses a lot of good qualities that make a great podcast conversation. Why are you not calling it a simple interview instead of podcast? I told you this. Not all simple interviews are as engaging, as exclusive, as customized, as personalized. In not in all interviews, it most interviews have become podcasts now actually, but then these little nuances like your how personal you make it, how engaging, how much you make that other person feel like he's part of that room, perhaps does not happen in what you call a simple interview. But those lines are definitely blurring now. So you would see a lot of interviews becoming podcasts and a lot of podcasts becoming interviews. How to start a pod, I think I covered it fairly well in my discussion. For a college student, who should I invite so that I can start my podcast, and how to do that? Always a college student or a CEO, it always depends on the topic. Of course, your reach as well. So that's a good question, actually, because you should always choose topics. And this is a problem we faced when we were starting out the podcast. Now we can get almost everyone in the world or in India as an expert on our podcast, but that was not the case before. So then we had to choose topics where we could get good um, guests. So for a college student, your most the easiest gets for you would be professors and academicians. And let me tell you, they are often the best guests. For we get a lot of professors, and they have been just phenomenal on everything from history to politics to tech to AI to banking. I am alumni. I did my executive MBA from IM, and I've got the person who's taught us stock markets. I've got him as a guest on many of my episodes, and those episodes have been phenomenal. The way they can explain at the end of the day, the podcast is about insights and explanations that really touches the listener or the viewer, right? And in that form, it's academicians are absolutely brilliant. Can we use AI? Covered. Eligibility, broad question, but I covered it. Topics for targeting Gen Z audience, whatever, just go to Instagram, whatever's trending. um, from fashion to music to wellness to mental health to sports to work life balance. How to grow an audience, I think I covered it fairly well. Lots of platforms to do that. Start with compelling content, of course, but a mix of promotion, marketing, great platforms, great topics will get you an audience. Okay, there's a lot of questions. What do I do? There's a lot of questions. I can't take everyone.
This we the time is up, Anirban.
Yeah,
I mean the other questions are fairly similar to the ones that have already been asked, so
right.
I think we can skip those. That's all the time we have today, dear learners. We hope
Thank you
most
so
of your
much.
questions were answered. Before you leave, please provide us with feedback on this webinar by completing a survey as you exit. A recording of this webinar will be available in your LMS if you wish to view it again. I reiterate, A recording of this will be available in the homepage of your LMS if you want to view it again. Thank you once again, Anirban, for this invaluable session. I am
Thank you.
sure our participants have learned something new today, both that is both informative and useful. And a big shout out to all our learners. It's been great to see this level of participation. Thank you and have a very good evening.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you.